Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's May 21st, 2021, and today we are talking with Dr. Nick Cheesman, Fellow in the Department of Political and Social Change at the Australian National University. Nick was one of the first guests on this show more than 5 years ago, when he and I discussed his 2015 book, Opposing the Rule of Law, How Myanmar's Courts Make Law and Order, a text that remains salient today, and I continue to recommend to anyone with a legal and a Myanmar interest. Hello, Nick.
Hello, Luke. Thanks for having me on.
Today, we will be discussing a distressing and a difficult topic. Listeners who have been tortured or know people who have been tortured or know people who may be currently disappeared or imprisoned in Myanmar are advised to take care when listening to this podcast, as we do discuss this and related traumatic events. Okay, the military coup of February 1, 2021 has upended Myanmar's political landscape and has resulted in huge numbers of protests and of state violence. We know this because despite huge problems with communication, as the State Administration Council, the SAC, cracks down on internet use, there are still many anecdotes and verified reports coming out of torture of political prisoners and of civilians by the state, and these are currently being recorded by human rights groups in spreadsheets around the globe. So, Nick, could you please give us an overview of the increase in and the use of state terror in Myanmar since the coup of February 1st, 2021, and perhaps reflects on its use in the past as well?
The military coup of 1st of February was followed by a period in which very quickly large numbers of people rose up in opposition to the takeover all around the country. There were protests of a variety of different sorts, beginning notably with some protests by professional groups, the doctors, but also in parallel with them by traditional modes of protest like the pots and pans protests to ward off or drive out evils that quickly reached a crescendo within the first days of February after the coup. These were followed then by organizing of protests on the streets through online communications as well as through traditional networks in neighborhoods and townships and villages. And so by the end of February and into March, protests had reached numbers that had not been seen since the protests of 1988, certainly much greater in scale than those of 2007. And at that time, it seemed as if the military was going to take a wait-and-see approach. But of course, the military plays the long game, and throughout it was working strategically, first to bring forward the police paramilitary forces to do the preliminary work in control and containment as it saw it of the protests, and then gradually to bring army personnel out onto the streets as a backup, and then subsequently to bring them to the foreground. And we know from every previous occasion of the modern history of Myanmar, when the military comes onto the streets, it shoots, and it shoots to kill, and it did so again in 2021. Through incrementally increased violence, in particular through the use of targeted killings that were seemingly arbitrary in their character, but also were systematic. In other words, by identifying protesters and shooting to kill individual protesters, and then gradually increasing the numbers until by the end of March, we had hundreds of people who were being killed. On some days, more than 100 people killed within a single day. Simultaneously, the increasing use of all kinds of violence, in particular, the emergence of what I've referred to in the past, and we see again now, of the camp, which is to say, a mode of arbitrary detention such that people's bodies, some living, some dead, are taken to locations where they're held for indeterminable periods of time. sorted into different categories, and some of them sent for processing by either military tribunals or civilian courts, and others are released. This is what we see by the time we get to April and May, the expansion of these forms of arbitrary detention and torture alongside the use of violence on the streets. And now I think we're in May that we're at a phase that as the military consolidates and the character of the protest changes increasingly now, there's a violence being directed against military personnel. There are attacks on officials in towns and cities around the country. The character then of the violence also from the military side, the state terror is changing. It's becoming increasingly directed to the identification and removal of people who are responsible for these attacks, and the increased use of the juridical apparatus for the prosecution and imprisonment of protesters. And I think we can expect that to continue.
There's a lot going on at the moment regarding abduction, and this camp, this term, the camp, this figurative term that you've just employed sounds quite interesting when we think of torture and camps. Living in the West, we might go towards all of the history and the media we've consumed about the Holocaust, but you are not referring to explicitly and only exclusively large imposing buildings, are you? The camp is also a state of mind?
Well, the camp is temporally and spatially specific but ambiguous simultaneously. The idea of the camp comes from the work of Giorgio Agamben, who used the historically specific character of the concentration camps as a starting point for conceptualizing the camp. Then he went on to think about how the camp, as any site in any time or place, does certain kinds of work to produce a certain kind of subjectivity. And the specific characteristic of the camp that he pointed to is that law exists in the camp through its own suspension, which is to say that it's not the state of nature, if you will, in a Hobbesian sense, a condition prior to the existence of the state, but rather it's the presence of something by virtue of its absence. In other words, in Myanmar, rather than think about detention as being something that occurs through the arrangements of the Criminal Procedure Code, which themselves are quite expansive, given that the Criminal Procedure Code is the product of an imperial regime, an imperial program for political domination of others, and therefore it was intended all along to be an instrument, if you will, for political domination. But it's, in the case of the camp, it expands beyond the terms and conditions of the Criminal Procedure Code or other legal arrangements for the detention of people in specifically identifiable locations such that they might have access to a lawyer, meet with their family members and whatever else, and into domains in which law is present, as I said already, by its absence. So the body who is placed in the camp, the body that ought to be subject to the terms and conditions of colonial era positive law reinterpreted in the military state of post-colonial Myanmar, is instead placed in a condition of suspended animation, if you will, temporally and spatially, and as a consequence is made vulnerable to any type of physical or mental intervention, i.e. the use of torture and other methods to dominate that body, to produce a condition in which that body is no longer, I would argue, a political body as such, because the body is incapable of communicating or acting in concert with others, and is also placed into what Alain Scari and others have referred to as a kind of a fantasy in which the torturer superimposes their will on the body of the person tortured and renders them unable to act or speak in the manner of a political being.
That's a very compelling explanation. I wonder whether it was the empirical events or these kinds of theoretical insights and your academic interests that inspired you to making torture your explicit research focus for the last few years. And then when you focus on torture, why do you decry foci on its instrumentality that seems so common?
To the first question, you mentioned at the outset the book that I published in 2015. And when I was going back to that work and thinking about what remained to be done, what came back to me again and again was the inadequacy with which I'd addressed the questions of torture that had emerged in that project. One reason that the work that I did then I felt was inadequate was that I hadn't been attending directly to the relationship between violence, state ideas and practices, and the power relations that emerge in the moment of torture. In the course of doing that work, in which I had looked at hundreds of criminal cases, I came across many accounts of torture, and I attempted to write out and offer explanations as to why torture occurred the way it did. And yet when I went back and re-examined those accounts and my explanations, I felt that the explanations I'd offered were superficial. And the more I thought about it, the more it occurred to me that this practice of torture was really central to how we might theorize the relationship between violence, law, and the idea of the state in our time. The tendency in some parts of the literature on torture is to concentrate on its instrumentalities. And that's best exhibited by the question, the recurrent question, which is not only evident in academic work, but also in the popular media: does torture work? And the more I thought about this question, the more I thought that it's a form of misguidance, because it directs us again and again to think about torture strictly in terms of its instrumentalities, in the means-end relationship that adheres to this form of violence. Now, I don't want for a moment to suggest that there isn't a means-end relationship present here. Indeed, all violence has a means-end quality to it. Arguably, there are no ends that adhere to any form of violence if we adopt a Benjaminian position. But I wanted to think about how it may not be all that there is to it, and that it may then restrict our attention to the phenomenon. Additionally, it may also put us, if you will, in the wrong location to think about it, because the question, does torture work, is effectively the question that the torturer must ask themselves. It's to adopt the position of the torturer. And I think that's, in some ways, politically, it's an irresponsible position to adopt, and intellectually, it's disabling. Also, it prohibits us from attending to the structural or institutional features of the phenomenon that I thought were important, precisely because they would get back then to the constitutive characteristics of torture that interested me. So to sum up then, that led me to the question, what work does torture do? And in changing the character of the question, I felt then that I would be able to offer a more expansive account, and one that attends, as I said already, to how torture is in some way constitutive of or state practice, or exemplary of how law, violence, and the idea of the state meet in a specific moment. Having said all of that, let me correct something that I've been saying throughout. Well, for the sake of discussion, I've been using the term torturer or the torturer. It's important to note when thinking politically about torture, just as the person who is tortured is isolated, i.e. they're prohibited from having the kind of engagement they would have with others that would make them a political being, the torturer is never isolated. It's actually empirically only possible ever to speak of torturers, plural. Torturers, plural, in the sense that in the cases that I've documented, both in Thailand and Myanmar, there is always more than one person present in the practice of torture itself, but also because torturers are never themselves isolated. So again, the question enables me to move away from that tendency to look towards the torturer as though they are a single goal-oriented, skilled, trained individual capable of extracting, as it were, something from the person who is subjected to torture, that fictitious scenario that philosophers and Hollywood film directors play with, and instead place torture in, empirically, if you will, in its proper location, one that we attend to the plurality of torturers and then the implications for our thinking about state practice through that plurality, in contradistinction to the tortured person who is subjected to a kind of anti-politics whereby they're isolated and ideally incapable of acting or talking politically.
Okay, Nick. Now, keeping in mind what you've just said about torturers and much else, you yourself have spent quite some time living in refugee camps, and then later in your research career poring over testimonies of torture from people within Myanmar and now Thailand. And these testimonies have not just come directly to you or through sympathetic intermediaries, but they've also come from official state documents. For example, detailed descriptions of torture in Myanmar court records that, while shocking, kind of seem to have been legally meaningless. What can we learn from these kinds of testimonies? For example, the testimony of Pyo Wei Aung. What happened to him?
The work that I've done over the past decade, one of the premises of it was precisely that a lot more was revealed through official documentation than people would tend to assume. And this is not only the case in Myanmar. Scholars of state violence in many countries point to how violent bureaucratic states document things. And the question is not whether or not there is documentation, but whether or not the researcher has the means to get access to it. In attending to court records, we see how indeed those records put down the details of testimonies where defendants, their lawyers and others speak to state violence. And you mentioned a specific case that I wrote about a number of years ago. That case concerned Pyo Wei Aung, who was an engineer by training, who was taken into the camp, if you will. He was removed from his house late one night in 2010 and taken to a special police facility at Ong Thap, a place that still exists in Yangon and presumably is being used for the detention, interrogation and torture of people in 2021. So Pyo Wei Aung was taken to Ong Thap, and there the police who had taken him accused him of being involved in carrying out a bombing attack on the Thinchan Water Festival in 2010, in which a number of people died. Pyo Wei Aung had in fact on that day been working at a supermarket, renovating it. Nevertheless, the police insisted that he take responsibility, and over a number of days tortured him to obtain the confession. Ultimately, he did give the confession because he saw no way out of the torture. This is the logic, of course, is not to obtain a statement that has any type of validity, but rather the torturers, plural, put their words into the mouth, if you will, of the tortured person. But when he finally came to the trial, which was held behind closed doors at the courthouse adjacent to the central prison, at that time, Pyo Wei Aung gave a detailed testimony over a period of 3 days of how he had been taken away, where he had been detained, how he was tortured, which police were involved. The court acknowledged these, I think it was approximately 160 pages of testimony with 4 or 5 lines in the verdict in which the judge ruled that, well, the accused had indicated that he had been tortured and the confession had been taken from him by force. The confession was legally acceptable because it had been signed before a judge, and therefore the court had no reason to doubt the veracity of the confession, and he was subsequently imprisoned. He was released under the government of the former General Thein Sein. However, he died shortly after his release as a result of the injuries he'd sustained due to torture and ill health that he'd suffered without adequate medication during the time that he was in prison. So his story is indicative of conditions for people who experience torture, are then tried and convicted, and is interesting and important, not only because of the characteristics that I mentioned already, but precisely because of the determination of Pyo Wei Aung to speak in such detail about what he experienced, and yet ultimately to have it be of no avail in as much as the verdict of the court was predetermined. Now, having said all of that, when he was released, in the short time that he lived, Pyo Wei Aung did do as much as he could to try and highlight what had happened to him and bring the perpetrators of torture and others involved in the case to account. And at that time, it was possible to hold press conferences, and actually his case generated a certain amount of discussion. But not only was it the case that it didn't then lead to any significant outcomes for him, but additionally, it failed to really generate the kind of discussion about the use of torture that we might have expected to emerge in the mid-2010s. It didn't succeed in resulting, for instance, in others who had experienced similar kinds of torture at the hands of special police and the military in this period coming forward. We didn't see a movement of the sort that we've seen in some other countries coalesce around torture survivors. There's certainly a lot of work done by groups like AAPP trying to work with torture survivors in order that they obtain medicalized interventions for their physical and mental health. Some work was done through AAPP by Johns Hopkins University, and there were other universities and institutions from abroad that were involved. But most of that work centered on the care and treatment and social and economic conditions of the survivors of torture and former political prisoners. There was never really a political debate that emerged, and we might dwell on reasons for that. But let me just conclude by noting a couple that seem obvious to me. One is that there were so many other issues at play in the 2010s with the National League for Democracy of the second half of the decade in government, that torture was just one among many other concerns that needed to be addressed. Secondarily, because at that time the torture of political detainees was no longer current, it was no longer salient in the way that it was in the 1990s and 2000s, the issue generally obtained a lower priority. So this is not to say that torture ceased in the 2010s, but rather that it was restricted predominantly to ordinary criminal accused, not to political detainees. And therefore, because it's political detainees that tend to drive these debates, it hadn't obtained then the attention that it might otherwise have done. And lastly, there was, on the part of the National League for Democracy government, a conservatism and reluctance to work with people who were interested to pursue discussions around past atrocities and violence by state institutions for a variety of different reasons. But that meant that anyone who was trying to make headway on a topic like this, like Pyo Wei-ong, was unlikely to obtain support from the National League for Democracy government, which in a way is a terrible irony, given that, in fact, quite a number of the people who are in the legislatures, both at the national and also at state and regional levels, were themselves torture survivors.
That's right. And when I was living in Myanmar, which was, mostly during the NLD's incumbency, or what some people are now calling the diarchic period, I met many NLD folk, and I was surprised by how survivors of political torture, you could say, related to the experience. For lack of a better description, they sort of seemed to feel like they were doing their duty by being tortured.
There's been excellent work done by psychologists elsewhere, but also by some other social scientists looking at exactly this phenomenon. For instance, in the case of Turkey, among survivors of torture in the Kurdish population, there is precisely this distinction between those who have experienced what might be classed as political torture and those who have experienced torture as an ordinary criminal accused. And the specific difference is exactly what you were touching upon. That is, a sense that of the former political detainee, that there was a reason for their being tortured. So they can locate this form of state violence in relation to their own prior practices by attending to how it was that because they were politically active, they were politically virtuous, they were struggling for something good and meaningful, for freedom or truth or democracy or whatever other terms you want to apply to it. Therefore, the torture is rendered somehow sensible, even though in the moment of torture itself, there is no coherence, that there is nothing about it which is meaningful or sensible.
Nick, before we finish up, I feel like I would really like to hear your thoughts more on the police. I mean, we've talked about state terror and torture as being part of state terror. And you've said terror makes the military state what it is. And we've discussed a few different organs already, the army, the police, the judiciary. But, judges don't go out and physically torture people. And when you were writing about Pyo Wee Aung, you called the police sovereign police, and you said that through their actions, they were establishing purposefully their innate superiority, not only to the person they were torturing, but also to the court. So I wonder, do you have anything else to say about the use of torture in Myanmar regarding the Myanmar police force? What's this innate superiority that they purposefully establish?
This is a difficult question to address in the current moment, because in the moment in which state terror is at its apex, as it is when the military is on the streets and active in the way that it is presently, when military tribunals are operating in areas that are under what's referred to formally as martial law, and when there's a nascent urban-based insurgency, the work that the military does exceeds anything that the police do. At times like those in which I was writing in the 2000s and early 2010s, when the military dictatorship at that time had consolidated its position and for the most part was able to turn over the day-to-day business of the security of the state to the police force, then we see the police in that foreground role and that elevated role of the sort that I wrote about at that time. And the point that I was making was that the police officer as torturer was analogous to the sovereign in the Hobbesian sense. The Hobbesian sovereign being a sovereign who, by virtue of a contract between the subjects of the sovereign, then emerges in a position such that effectively they can do no wrong, short of being an existential threat to the political community itself. There are no grounds for the individual subject to oppose the will of the sovereign. So I suggested that we see in the moment of police torture of the sort that I was describing around 2010, 2011 and 2012, an analogous situation in which the police officer is occupying a position that is kind of like the sovereign, that there's no recourse that the person tortured has in response to the fact of torture, either in the moment of torture itself or subsequently, as we see in the case of Pyo Wee Aung, who was so eloquent and determined, and yet ultimately none of his complaints, his grievances amounted to anything at all, precisely because the police officer has that position. Now, the special police, in the form of the special branch, aka the political police, if you will, in conventional language, are still present and active in ways that they were in the 2000s. And their role in the 2000s had expanded as a result of the demise of the former military intelligence service under Lieutenant General Kim Yun, who was removed, as we know, from office in 2004. So I think the question that we have right now that, at least for me personally, remains unanswered to go to where we began the discussion was whether or not a military intelligence in its new form as the military affairs security plays an active part in the program for detention, interrogation and torture of detainees in the way that the old military intelligence did, or whether it pushes the responsibility onto the political police, the special branch. The only other thing I would say with regards to the police at this point is that in Myanmar, the police are functionally separated into police battalions, and then the police who are responsible for specific territories, township-based, district-based, state and regional-based police forces, all of them in a central structure. The police battalions are effectively a military operation. There is nothing about them that in any way resembles police in the sense that they would be understood, say, in Europe or in settler colonies like Australia. It's a military force, and the function of it is precisely to do the kind of work that the military does, but in response to security threats in urban areas, the sort that we've seen since the February 1st coup. That said, the township-based police and the other territorially-based police also are not, in many respects, comparable to the police forces that we might find in former imperial metropoles or settler colonies, because they emerged out of a colonial context. So policing in a colonial setting is never about the kind of metropolitan policing that was first envisaged and then built up, for the sake of discussion, with reference to the former colonial occupier in Britain in the first part of the 19th century, the intention being to have a civilian force that's part of everyday life, that gathers information by virtue of the fact that it's part of the community. By contrast, the colonial police force is all about the maintenance of law and order. Its program is not primarily about the identification of individual subjects who are responsible for crimes, but rather the threat that the subject poses to public order as understood by a colonial state. And it's that way of thinking and organizing police that continued into the post-colony, as Mary Callaghan once referred to it, the rickety yet repressive architecture of the colony that continued into 1950s and 1960s Burma, and indeed has been re-engineered by subsequent military regimes. Consequently, we don't have the kinds of relationships between police forces in Myanmar and the subject populations at any time of the sort that we see, say, in the settler colonies or former imperial metropoles. And indeed, the police force in Myanmar has always worked towards the kinds of interventions of the sort that we're seeing in the context of the military coup now, i.e. interventions that are aimed primarily at the maintenance of the management of public order or law and order, rather than criminal investigations through civilian institutions. Ultimately, the point is that the police force in Myanmar has been and remains a proxy of the military.
That's a sensational description, Nick, of the cops. Thank you very much for that. And on that note, it's time to move to recommendations. At the end of each episode, the guest on Myanmar Musings traditionally provides a recommendation to listeners, which can be anything to do with Myanmar. In these somber times, what is your recommendation?
My recommendation is perhaps for the time being to do away with recommendations. I think that recommendations sometimes can get in the way of ways of thinking and talking productively about the kind of situation we see in Myanmar today. And what we really need is creative thinking that transcends the kinds of action-oriented manner in which recommendations are delivered to people, including your audience. Perhaps that is by way of a recommendation, but if so, it's intended ironically.
Okay, Nick, that's probably the most honest recommendation we've ever received here on Myanmar Musings. Thank you for that, and thank you for everything you've said today and coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.